People interested in true crime are always baffled by the why. Why would someone do these things? What path in life could possibly have led them to commit such atrocious acts? In this podcast, we aim to explore the upbringings and backgrounds of some of history's worst criminals, but with a twist. Because we want you to set aside what you already know about them, we won't use their names until the end of the show, so you can listen anew and hopefully get insight into the question that haunts us the most. Why did they do it? Join us as we explore the catalyst. The Pacific Northwest is a beautiful country with proud mountains and lush forests. If you enjoy hiking, striking landscapes, coffee, and rain, then this region is for you. But one morning, this is also the area that a man we will call the Evangelical roamed, where he hunted, disposed of dozens of his victims, and then revisited them to engage in acts of necrophilia. Beginning in 1982, he would kill at least 71 girls and women in Washington state, but later he would tell authorities that he had killed so many that he'd simply lost count. Many of his victims were believed to be sex workers whom he had frequented, setting off an inner war between the evangelicals' sexual obsession and what Time magazine called his staunch religious beliefs. That war had a high cost, claiming the lives of perhaps more than 100 women in the Seattle-Tacoma area, though the true number we may never know. Born in Salt Lake City on February 18, 1949, the Evangelical was the middle of 3 sons. When his father, Thomas, could get the work, he preferred driving trucks, a job that would take him away from home for long periods of time. Thomas also held a job as a city bus driver and complained about the presence of sex workers along his route. Meanwhile, his mother, Mary, who was only 21 when her middle son was born, raised her sons in a 600-square-foot home. The 3 boys all shared a room and preferred to spend the majority of their waking hours outside. When the Evangelical was 11 years old, the family relocated to Washington state, in the area just south of Seattle that, according to authors Carlton Smith and Tomas Guillen, would become known as the SeaTac Strip. The Evangelical's mother was physically and sexually abusive, which led to a complex relationship. Her son would later complain that he could never seem to please her, something that caused him to seek her approval all the more. Smith and Guillen describe Mary as particularly high-strung and caustic, saying that the Evangelical's second wife described her mother-in-law's fashion sense as provocative, tight clothes, lots of makeup, kind of in line with a sex worker. The children also watched their mother abuse their father when he was home. Once, when Tom had a cold, Mary couldn't stand the coughing and broke a plate over his head while sitting at the dinner table. Rather than respond with violence, Tom only got up and left the room. Writers Nicole Levi Menezes and Maria Shields described in an article they wrote for Nova Southeastern University that Mary would dress provocatively for her job as a clerk at JCPenney's, and when she came home from work, she would tell her family how men had become aroused while she measured them for their suits, and actually tell her child how the men's genitals smelled. The Evangelical both loved and feared his mother. He would later share that he would have fantasies of having sex with her, then stabbing her to death, and then burning the house down around her corpse. According to Smith and Guillen, this fantasy was an indication of his feelings of humiliation and wanting to gain control over what he considered a dominating woman. That the Evangelical was a bedwetter after the age of 7 can also be considered an indicator of possible future violent behavior. According to Why Do Serial Killers Often Wet the Bed as Kids from Grunge, there's a link between bedwetting and childhood trauma. For example, if a child was neglected, such as being left in soiled diapers, punished for having an accident, or simply not being given the attention or encouragement required to master going to the bathroom, insecurity, anxiety, and trauma can build up until it morphs into violent behavior. Angry that her middle son regularly wet the bed until he was 13, Mary violently washed his genitals after every instance of bedwetting. According to that Nova Southeastern article, Mary would strip down next to nothing while bathing her son. It of course didn't help that she would berate him in front of his two brothers after every instance too, singling the evangelical out, only heightening his shame and humiliation. Additionally, the evangelical tortured and killed small animals. That's another warning sign, which of course is another indicator of potential future violence. As Adam Llanos wrote on A&E's True Crime blog, the most notable example was when the evangelical killed a cat by trapping it in a freezer. Eventually, there was a point where he couldn't hold in his desire to escalate from animals to humans. When he was 15 or 16, he approached a boy about 6 years old who lived in his neighborhood. He asked the boy if he wanted to build a fort. The boy agreed, but then the evangelical told him there would be people around who liked to kill little kids like him, and he stabbed the little boy with a pocket knife. Decades later, the victim recalled asking the evangelical why he had stabbed him. He stood there, his shirt soaked with blood, and the evangelical started to laugh. The knife was still in his hand as he reached it out again, but only to wipe the blood onto the boy's shirt as he said, "I always wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody." The boy ran home, blood seeping into his pants, and he wound up staying in the hospital for several weeks as the knife had nicked his liver. Now, the evangelical was able to outrun a number of his problematic behaviors because during his teenage years, the family moved frequently as Tom chased different truck driver jobs. No matter where he went, though, the evangelical had problems at school because of dyslexia. He was eventually held back 2 years. He resented his brothers, one younger and one older, for being smarter than he. He even wondered if he'd been adopted by Mary and Tom. His IQ was tested later in life and showed a score of 82, a borderline impairment. His attorney, Patty Eakes, later told A&E that the evangelical was obviously intellectually limited, and the only time he genuinely cried was when he talked about being afraid of being labeled as mentally disabled. It didn't help that his mother, Mary, often threatened to put him in a state institution for the developmentally disabled. At 20 years old, he graduated high school in June 1969. 2 months later, he joined the U.S. Navy at the height of the Vietnam conflict. The evangelical married his first wife, Claudia, 14 months later in Seattle. Smith and Guillen wrote that he was first stationed in the Philippines, where he patronized sex workers and contracted a sexually transmitted infection. In an incredibly hypocritical move, he dissolved his marriage when he returned home and discovered that, in his absence, his wife had had an affair. Speaking to Time magazine, his brother Greg later remembered, quote, "He spent his time on rivers and patrol boats being shot at. These were things we didn't talk about. His anger about things in Vietnam, if there was any. When he turned from war in 1971, he got a job at a Renton, Washington factory painting Kenworth trucks and would keep his job for the next 30 years. End quote. According to Smith and Guillen, this is yet another piece of the puzzle in the FBI's profile of serial killers. They often have a simple, mind-numbing job that leaves them ample time and energy to complete their deadly work. The evangelical's job at the Kenworth factory was just that, a simple job that, once you got the hang of it, rarely changed and had few challenges. 2 years into this job, he married again to Marcia Winslow, and this marriage would last from the end of 1973 until the middle of summer 1980. He and Marcia had a son during their almost 7 years of marriage, a son who would inadvertently serve as an accessory to his father's crimes. Marcia told Time magazine that the evangelical earned his name during this time, becoming fanatical about religion. He would go door to door proselytizing for a Pentecostal church and would turn irate when people refused to listen to him. She also said that he would sit in front of their television with an open Bible on his lap, judging what flickered on the screen. He also often sobbed his way through church services. Marcia told multiple journalists and writers after her ex-husband was arrested about the strange things he did while they were married. She said that the evangelical enjoyed having sex outdoors and was interested in bondage. This was backed up by his other wives and girlfriends, who also said that he wanted to have sex several times a day, sometimes even in the same wooded areas where his victims would later be discovered. He liked going on walks in the woods with Marcia, but he would disappear off the trail only to come up from behind her to frighten her. In one instance, when he came up behind her, he put her in a chokehold using the crook of his elbow. This would become part of the evangelical's signature. His second marriage ended for the same hypocritical reasons as his first. He accused Marcia of infidelity while also continuing to visit numerous sex workers, coming home late at night without any explanation. His and Marcia's divorce ended in the spring of 1981, with the couple agreeing to share custody of their son, who was 6 at the time. Alone for the first time in 7 years, the evangelical bought a small home in King County, Washington, and lived alone while dating, finding women through support groups like Parent Without Partners. Even though he was meeting women, his visits to sex workers increased dramatically. He would admit later that he was addicted to sex workers the same way an alcoholic was driven to drink. A frequent visitor to the Strip, an 8-mile section of the Pacific Highway that ran along the airport south of Seattle, he and other men looking for sex could find sex workers standing on the street waiting for customers and motels that rented their rooms by the hour. It was incredibly convenient that this stretch of highway just happened to be on the evangelical's way home from work. When witnesses and other evidence put him in the company of victims, the evangelical would claim his addiction was the only reason he had been seen with them, not because he had anything to do with their deaths. It was during his time between wives number 2 and number 3 that the evangelical's first known victims were discovered. His first victim was found by 2 boys on July 15, 1982. According to author Ann Rule, the remains had caught on pilings under the Peck Bridge on Meeker Street in Kent, Washington. In her book on the case, Rule described the victim as white, about 25 years old, 5'4", and roughly 140 pounds. While the victim's clothes weren't distinctive, she had multiple tattoos, including a Harley-Davidson insignia on her back and the unfinished outline of a unicorn on her lower abdomen. She would be identified as 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield, who, according to her mother, had been working as a sex worker. Paint found on Wendy's body was collected, but wouldn't be tested for 20 years. If the paint had been tested immediately, it's possible the police would have arrested the evangelical much faster, because that paint was not sold publicly. According to NBC News, it was sold only to paint Kenworth trucks. As additional remains were found, a pattern emerged. The majority of victims were either sex workers, runaways, or other women living in high-risk environments along the Strip. According to official court documents, he also patrolled other areas of the Pacific Highway, including Rainier Valley, Seattle's International District, downtown Seattle, and North Seattle along Aurora Avenue. One of the preferred tactics was to back his truck into a parking spot of a 7-Eleven on the Pacific Highway and raise the hood on his truck so he could pretend to work on his engine while he watched traffic. The evangelical told Norm Mailing, the King County prosecuting attorney, that he chose to kill sex workers because they were the easiest, and because he believed the police wouldn't look as hard to solve the crimes. After a few bodies were found, the sex workers began asking questions, attempting to vet their clients before climbing into cars. The evangelical learned to gain their confidence by playing into his smaller stature. Another tactic was providing too much information, showing the woman his wallet, his ID, and, horrifically, photos of his son. He even kept toys on the dash of his truck specifically to gain the trust of his victims. As he preferred to kill victims in his home, he not only needed to convince them to get into his truck, but he also had to convince them that they couldn't just have sex in the cab or the bed of the vehicle. To do this, the Evangelical would leave a spare tire in the cab to take up space. Once they were in his home, he would also use his son's room in his house to gain his victim's trust. He later told the Seattle Times that the women would look around. They'd get more and more secure as they went, looking into the bedroom, seeing that nobody was there. There was just his son's room. And that, he said, led to them thinking, quote, "Hey, this guy has a son. He's not going to hurt anybody," end quote. One of the Evangelical signatures was returning to the disposal site and engaging in necrophilia with his deceased victims. According to court documents, he admitted that more than one victim had decomposed to the point of having maggots when he raped the remains. This need was so strong that he was willing to revisit his disposal sites even when his son was along with him. While his son slept in the cab of the truck, the Evangelical quietly got out, had intercourse with the remains of his victim about 30 feet away, and then returned. During his police interviews, he assured the detectives that his son never saw anything because he was a heavy sleeper. Once 4 victims were found, the King County Sheriff's Office formed a task force to investigate the murders. According to the Seattle Times, this was the largest task force since the one created to find Ted Bundy a decade earlier. Among the members were detectives Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert, 2 men who would make finding the Evangelical their life's work. Time magazine called it an obsessive personal quest for Reichert. As a deeply religious man, he told Time, quote, "I would come home after finding a 15-year-old girl, melting flesh off her face, body falling apart, the stench of rotting flesh. These are just the memories that float to the top," end quote. Reichert was born in Minnesota in 1950, making him only a few years younger than the Evangelical's prey. Also, like the Evangelical, his family moved to Washington when he was 11, and he'd grown up very poor. From the moment he joined the police department, he was determined to be a detective, to catch criminals like the killer now on his desk. The investigators were initially overwhelmed with information. Data, evidence, tips from police, that paint I mentioned earlier that wasn't tested for decades. According to Rachel Bell of Crime Library, the police were so overwhelmed they even enlisted volunteers to help. The majority of the victims were found nude and along the bank of a river. They were often placed together in groups, and the bodies were occasionally posed. Since nearly all of his victims were sex workers, the task force began to pay attention to men who were arrested for soliciting. So when the Evangelical was arrested in May 1982 for attempting to solicit a female police officer posing as a sex worker, he was questioned about the murders by the task force. While in custody, they administered a polygraph test, hoping they had found their killer. But according to the Crime Museum, he not only claimed to be innocent, but he passed the polygraph. Even so, before he was released, the task force collected hair and saliva samples from him just in case. Looking for a different perspective, hoping to shed some new light on the case, the task force asked Special Agent John Douglas to put together a profile of the killer that had been haunting their county for years. Douglas's profile described, quote, "a confident yet impulsive middle-aged man who would most likely frequent the murder scenes in order to reenact the crimes in his mind. The killer was probably familiar with the area and was likely to have deep religious convictions. He might have an active interest in police work, especially the investigation into the recent murders. The killer might even contact the police in an effort to assist the ongoing investigation," end quote. Between September 1982 and April 1983, roughly 14 young women, ages ranging from 15 to 23, disappeared from the Seattle-Tacoma area. But after the murder of Marie Malvar at the end of April 1983, all leads the task force had been chasing collapsed. Suspects they had been investigating had checked out, and while they still had the Evangelical in the back of their minds, they had no concrete evidence to support their hunch. As the task force reassessed their strategies, including bringing in Detective Robert Kreppel to sift through the case files with the eye of a criminalist, at least 18 more women disappeared. The youngest was 15, and the oldest was only 26. Not all of their bodies were found. It was difficult for the task force to accurately know the true number of women disappearing, as few of them were reported missing. Of those who disappeared in the spring and summer of 1983, just a handful of missing persons reports were filed. As 1983 turned into 1984, the official count of the Evangelical at the time was estimated to be 11 or 12, but with the information known today, it's likely it was much higher by that point, closer to 18. That's based upon the remains that had been found and the women who had disappeared. In short, some likely victims aren't included in the official list of victims, at least according to Crime Library. 2 years after the task force was formed, Detective Reichert changed tactics. He thought he could catch his serial killer by learning about killers who had already been caught. He studied John Wayne Gacy, Gerald Stano, and Randy Kraft, and contacted police departments who had dealt with serial killers. In a bold move, he flew to Florida in 1984 to speak to a serial killer who was sitting on death row. Detective Reichert sat down across from Ted Bundy, staring at his hands, and wondered how many people those hands had actually killed. While he knew that Bundy was likely to play mind games with him, Reichert stayed in Florida for 2 days, hoping to gain some insight into his case. According to Time magazine, Reichert realized that Bundy talked in circles and clearly was referring to himself sometimes when he was purportedly talking about the Evangelical. Reichert gained some insights nonetheless. Among those, a serial killer doesn't leave home in the morning compelled to kill. He will do it when he feels like it and when he feels safe. He needs to be in control. Bundy told Reichert the police were giving too much information to the press and concurred with Reichert's suspicion that the killer was, at times, taunting the cops. Even armed with new insights from a like-minded killer, Reichert and the task force were still at a loss. At the task force's height in 1986, its 56 members were chasing down 47,000 tips with as many as 17,000 names. With the investigation in its 5th year, the media began to mock the task force. The Seattle Times ran political cartoons portraying them as more like Keystone cops than officers looking for a serial killer, calling them the task farce. Unsurprisingly, the continued attacks from the press and the public sank police morale. Reichert told Time, quote, "It was like, are you guys so stupid you can't make the connection?" End quote. Around the same time, the Evangelical met and married his 3rd and final wife, Judith. She would later tell police that he would leave early some mornings, telling her he had to pick up extra hours at the factory for overtime pay. He would tell authorities that he truly loved Judith, and that was why he only killed 3 women after marrying her. In 1987, police had compiled enough information on the Evangelical for a judge to sign a search warrant for his home. The police found nothing specific that would tie him to the murders, but took additional hair and saliva samples to add to their file, samples that would prove crucial 14 years later. The Evangelical was now one of Reichert's prime persons of interest, but according to Time, he knew he had barely any evidence, certainly nothing that would convince a DA, let alone a jury. Then came a crushing blow. Word came down that the task force was being dismantled, and by 1990, Reichert himself was promoted and assigned to other duties. By 91, just one single detective by the name of Tom Jensen was in charge of the case, but it was more of a babysitting situation than an actual investigation. However, Reichert never gave up. He felt he owed it to the families of the women to see the case through. Elected sheriff of King County in 1997, he was able to redirect resources to the case, a move made all the easier because DNA testing was now routinely used. Semen had been collected from 3 victims discovered in 1982 and 1983. They were Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, and Cynthia Hines. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab compared those samples with the Evangelical's known saliva. When the results arrived on September 10, 2001, Detective Tom Jensen handed Sheriff Reichert an envelope with just a name inside. Without even opening it, Reichert looked at Jensen and simply said, "It's him, isn't it?" The Evangelical was arrested November 30th as he was leaving work and charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder for the deaths of Carol Christensen, Cynthia Hines, Marcia Chapman, and Opal Mills. Reichert called it the most exciting day in his career and told the Seattle Times that the community had to be just as excited as those who worked on the case. In 2002, before the trial began against the Evangelical, his lawyer told Time that they would challenge the DNA evidence first, as it only proved that he was a customer of the sex workers, not that he killed them. In response, Reichert assembled 11 detectives to build an ironclad case against the Evangelical, while also examining the other 45 killings connected to him for the possibility of additional charges. One of the people they interviewed was, of course, the Evangelical's wife, Judith. She was so surprised when he was arrested, she asked the detectives if they were sure they had the right person. Calling him a kind and gentle man, she said their married life included weekends camping or hunting through garage sales, and she described him as romantic. It seemed the only way Judith could come to terms with her husband being a vicious serial killer was to see him as having a split personality, telling KIRO-TV that she hated the man, or the personality, who took her husband away from her. Upon learning that the Evangelical killed only 3 women after they were married, she told the news station that she felt that, by being his wife, she had saved lives. On March 27, 2003, the Evangelical was charged with 3 additional counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. Given the prosecuting attorney had filed his intention to seek the death penalty, defense attorneys reached out to ask if there was the possibility of a plea agreement. Prosecutors hesitated to deprive the community of justice, but they also knew their case wasn't as strong as they had hoped. So, on June 13, 2003, they entered a plea agreement into which the Evangelical, also known as Gary Leon Ridgway, agreed to provide complete, truthful, and candid information concerning his crimes in King County. He also agreed to disclose the precise location of all remains of his unknown and undiscovered victims. Lastly, Ridgway agreed to plead guilty to aggravated murder in the first degree for all murders he had committed in King County. Gary Ridgway, a.k.a. the Green River Killer, is currently serving life at Washington State Penitentiary for the vicious murders of at least 49 women in the 1980s and 1990s. He believed he could get away with killing his victims because they had lived on the margins of their communities, some as sex workers, some as runaways, but it turned out they weren't as easily forgotten as he had hoped. To research this case, historian Jen Erdman relied on articles from Time magazine, the Seattle Times, and Crime Library. Other sources included The Search for the Green River Killer by Carlton Smith and Tomas Guillen, and Green River Running Red by Ann Rule, plus primary sources from the case itself. The Catalyst is a production of Grab Bag Collab, created and engineered by Amanda Rossman, and narrated and edited by Amber Hunt. You can support us and our other programs at patreon.com/grabbagcollab. That's GRABBAGCOLLAB. Special thanks to Daisy Egan for being our first pass editor and a collaborator on Grab Bag. Music comes from Soundstripe Inc., my dad, Bruce Hunt, and my son, Hunt Van Benscoden.